Eric Byler, TYT Politics. I'm invisible, but you see Ida Chavez on your left of The Intercept, sent to us by Ryan Grimm, her boss at the Washington Bureau of The Intercept. And the Monopoly Man, Amanda Werner, on the right there. She was kind of an internet sensation a few weeks ago when she planted herself during a Senate financial banking hearing, dressed as a Monopoly Man, and sort of Reddit, Twitter blew up. Those of you who are big fans of Bernie Sanders, you might be sad to hear this, but she actually beat Bernie Sanders on the Ask Me Anything that she did on Twitter. It broke a record. And it brought attention to something that a lot of Americans probably otherwise would never have heard about. And unfortunately, it came to an unceremonious end yesterday when Donald Trump signed a law that prevents the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from protecting American consumers from basically hidden fine print little forced arbitration clauses that people unknowingly sign and then give away their right to a day in court when the large financial institutions rip them off. Did I say that well enough, Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, I think basically the law that passed last week and was signed into law by Donald Trump yesterday, it takes away our right to sue banks and lenders in court, specifically, big companies like Equifax and Wells Fargo that rip off millions of consumers at once. We now can't join together in class action lawsuits to hold them accountable. Instead, we have to go into a secret arbitration system where they pick a private firm to decide the case. They decide what rules apply, what kind of evidence we can present, and the average consumer ends up ordered to pay their bank or lender $7,725.
So the arbiter is someone who has an incentive to keep working for the financial institution, and somehow it just turns out they always rule against the average Joe in favor of the institution.
Yeah, 93% of the time when an arbitrator issues a decision, the company wins. So the system is now literally rigged against us, thanks to Donald Trump.
But if you are not going to go for a car loan or a home loan, if you're not going to be too involved with the big banks, maybe you're someone who only uses the community banks or that sort of thing. I mean, has every single American lost part of their rights in this, signing ceremony that happened yesterday, semi-signing ceremony? Or is it more in fact like our parents? Does it more affect the kind of people who, the people who own homes and are, buying multiple cars, that sort of thing?
Unfortunately, it does affect all of us. I mean, I think that's one reason the Wells Fargo and Equifax examples have really resonated with people. If you take Equifax, it affected 145 million Americans who got their data breached, put out there, basically puts us at severe threat of identity theft for the rest of our lives. And we didn't actually consent to this. We weren't customers of Equifax. They just used our data.
So everybody listening could potentially have had their data breached because you didn't have to consent to it.
No, in fact, John Oliver put it really well. We are not actually customers of these companies. We are, in fact, the products of the credit bureaus. They're selling our data to these financial companies to see if we're a good credit risk or not. So they don't really have any loyalty to us, which is one reason I think they weren't actually careful with our data. But now we can't actually sue them over this breach, over any future breaches that might happen, over, maybe let's say 10 years from now, somebody steals your identity based on this breach. You can't sue Equifax 10 years from now because this rule has now been repealed.
Well, unless something changes, and we'll get to that in a second. But Ida, this is not the first time that you met Amanda. Tell us about the first time and some of what you observed both at the Senate hearings and online when Amanda waltzed in dressed as the Monopoly Man.
Yeah, so my boss Ryan, he sent me to go cover a Wells Fargo hearing recently where they basically interrogated Sloan, the CEO of Wells Fargo, and his role in all of those fraudulent accounts. Amanda was standing outside of the hearing, dressed head to toe as the Monopoly Man. She was handing out get out of jail free passes, and she managed to get some to some senators walking into the hearing. But what really got her attention online was the fact that she managed to get into the hearing, which was pretty crowded, and then sit behind the people. So when on C-SPAN, when you could see the hearing, you could see her photobombing. And so a lot of people took screenshots, thought it was hilarious, posted it on Twitter, tons of retweets and likes, tens of thousands. It really blew up on Twitter.
And what is it? How did you beat Bernie Sanders?
So once this blew up the internet a little bit, I got asked to do an Ask Me Anything on Reddit, and ended up spending 4 hours online with Reddit users answering all their questions about the stunt, about my background, about forced arbitration, and somehow over 1.2 million people ended up interacting with me on that Ask Me Anything, and by the amount of upvotes, it actually is now I think the 8th or the 7th most popular AMA of all time, beating Bernie Sanders, Edward Snowden, the creator of The Simpsons. Like, we blew a lot of records out of the water, which I still don't totally understand, but thank you, Internet.
I think it may have something to do with the fact that you just kind of snuck in and did this, and you kind of messed up all the fuddy-duddies.
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely resonated with people in a way that, on some level we expected it to resonate. We didn't expect it to go quite as far as it did. But I think one reason it really took off, honestly, was it was, I think, 2 days after the Las Vegas shooting. It was a really hard news week. There was a ton of bad news coming out. And I think a lot of people just kind of needed a reprieve of that, needed something that was both funny and inspiring and energizing instead of this draining news that we're getting every day in 2017.
So one last thing before we move into next steps, and also I'm going to go check and see if there's any questions or comments from the audience. But yesterday it was signed by President Trump. Were there cameras? Is there video that we can see? Was there a big party, signing ceremony? What happened?
So there might have been a private party. I wouldn't be surprised. But no, Trump decided to sign away our right to a day in court in a private ceremony. The only people invited were banking lobbyists and executives. He did not do a big public announcement. In fact, he was, according to his schedule, signing it at 3:30, and then it wasn't until 6 p.m. they actually issued a press statement on it. They clearly didn't want coverage of this because it's so shameful. In fact, just earlier this week, the American Legion, the largest military organization in the country, who is very apolitical, in fact, Trump spoke at their national convention a few months ago, they actually called on Trump to veto this because it was so important to their members, because service members and veterans are disproportionately targeted by financial scams, and now they don't have the right to sue that they fight in wars for. So
are they just disproportionately targeted, or are they disproportionately victimized because they are out there fighting and they don't have the time to be watching to see if Wells Fargo added an insurance policy they didn't ask for, that kind of thing?
It's pretty much both. I mean, they're targeted in the sense that there are all these, payday lenders, financial scammers that pop up around military bases around the country because they're trying to get at the financial benefits that, accrue with people who join the military. But it's also that they are disproportionately affected because they're serving. In fact, there's legislation that Congress passed in 2003 called the Service Member Civil Relief Act that basically gives added protections to service members when they're serving abroad. Because you can imagine, if you fall behind on your car payments while you're off fighting in Iraq, you might lose track of that, and so they passed that law so that companies essentially couldn't repossess your car while you're out fighting in a war. And now, because forced arbitration is the law of the land, they can actually break those federal laws, and service members and veterans won't have any recourse.
Right. So even if they have broken a law, it wouldn't be a judge that would decide whether there's any compensation for the victim. It would be one of these arbitrators who are I guess you could say, in the pocket of their employers, which are these large financial institutions.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's really unfortunate here. There is no accountability in arbitration. We have a federal court system that honestly has a lot of problems, but it's built up rules and standards over hundreds of years since the founding of this country. Arbitration works around all of that. It's almost like going on Judge Judy. You're basically agreeing to let this random third-party person decide your case. They don't have to follow the law. They don't have to follow ethical standards. They can basically make whatever decision they want. In fact, we've seen it pop up in other circumstances. There are religious arbitrations that are, decided by Christian principles, or even actually, whatever religious principles you want to agree on, because
Sharia law? Could it be Sharia law?
I was gonna go there and I decided not to go there, but thanks for raising that, Eric. But yeah, I mean, that's actually the funny thing is you have these conservatives outcrying over, this false demon of Sharia law somehow. But what's funny is arbitration is actually the only way we will ever see Sharia law in this country, because you can agree to any principles you want, and this is being forced on consumers. It's not actually being chosen.
Now, speaking of conservatives, you are reaching out to conservatives to fight the next battle, and I'm going to hand the microphone over to Ida, and can you interview her about what the next steps are? Okay.
So what are the next steps? Like, is it completely over? Like, they can just take my money and I can't sue? Or...
Well, I'm trying to be an optimist, but I do have to say this was a huge blow. The way that the Republicans repealed this rule from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, they used this obscure tool known as the Congressional Review Act. This was something that was actually only used once since 1999, since it became a law. And it was repealing this very unpopular regulation that came out at the end of the Clinton administration. In 2017 alone, the CRA has been used 15 times to repeal public protections. And not only does it take away rules that agencies spent, on average, I think 5 or 6 years developing, a lot of taxpayer dollars were going into these public protections, but it actually stops the agency from ever issuing a similar rule. So the CFPB now cannot do anything about arbitration. It's a little bit unclear in the courts exactly what that means and how restrictive it is, but certainly the way that Republicans are trying to sell it, this stops the CFPB from doing anything to protect our right to a day in court. And so it's hard to see, a light at the end of the tunnel here. I will say I'm very inspired by, the way that the resistance, that citizen activism has been handling 2017. I think we've been dealt one of the biggest losses that we've seen really as a nation, and people have only come back stronger and fought harder. So I'm trying to take that perspective. We have indeed lost the right to sue banks and lenders. We've lost this one rule that would have restored our rights in that sector. But I hope that this will lead to larger legislation, hopefully 2019 after the 2018 elections. We can pass something more comprehensive that actually ensures that we have the right to sue all of these corporations when they break the law. In fact, Senator Franken, for the last several years, has been reintroducing a bill called the Arbitration Fairness Act, which would say that you cannot force consumers, workers, anyone into arbitration across sectors. So it would affect banks and lenders. It would affect employers, where arbitration is another huge issue. It would affect sexual harassment cases, discrimination cases, antitrust cases. It's much more comprehensive than this one rule would have been. And I hope that we'll use this defeat to basically win the larger war against forced arbitration. But unfortunately, it's not going to happen for at least a couple years.
Can you tell me a little bit about the vote itself? It was close, with Pence doing that tiebreaker. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it was extremely close. We fought a really tough battle here. I actually am the only person in the country who works full-time on this issue on the consumer side. So it's pretty amazing that we got as far as we did. We were up against the Chamber of Commerce, the American Bankers Association, all of the biggest lobbyists for the financial industry. They've spent, hundreds of millions of dollars on this campaign to repeal the rule. And yet we came within one vote. And that's another thing about the Congressional Review Act. It doesn't require 60 votes. It cannot be filibustered. It's this way for Republicans to get around regular order in the Senate. So they only need 50 plus 1 votes to do it, and that's what they ended up doing. It was a 50-50 tie, and Mike Pence had to actually come down from the White House and cast a tie-breaking vote. And what's especially disgusting is, as Mike Pence did this, he put out a statement saying that he was happy to stand up for consumers by repealing this rule.
Orwellian, isn't it?
It's completely shameless.
Okay, let me read a comment from the audience. So this is Anthony Farrell. He says, thanks for spreading the truth about this un-American sold out to corporations government that is temporarily in power. After these traitors to the American people are removed from office, these corporate actions must be undone. How easy would that be?
Well, it depends. It depends on what this looks like. I think there's a lot up in the air of how, the Trump administration might come to an end right now. I think it's something that we haven't really addressed as a country, depending on how the outcomes of the Russia investigation happen, if Trump was actually ever a legitimate president or not. I think we have reason to look back at what the Trump administration has done and say, were any of these things legitimate? Mike Pence cast a vote here. If he's not a legitimate vice president, maybe we should reconsider what that means. But I'm getting a little out of my own depth there. That's just more of my my hope of what happens.
Let's just say that that Congress switches hands.
Yeah.
Okay, so then you need a signature from the president. But you mentioned reaching out to conservatives. What's the argument that you would make to them? I don't remember exactly why it came up. Maybe you can remind me. But we were texting each other, and you're saying you're really trying to reach out to conservatives. So what's the strategy there?
Well, it's interesting, actually. Republican voters are completely against forced arbitration. We've been doing a lot of outreach to conservatives, and this really is a very nonpartisan issue outside of Washington. The vast majority of voters of both parties want their right to sue banks and lenders. And you can imagine why this doesn't actually come down to political party, because it's about our most basic constitutional rights. I actually really wish that people would treat our Seventh Amendment rights the way that folks treat our Second and First Amendment rights, because it's very essential to principles this country was founded on.
What is the argument that they make? Because how do you defend something like that?
Just say that again.
Oh, yeah. What is the argument that they make? Like, how does someone defend something like this?
So their arguments are very weak. I mean, first of all, they out and out lie, like Mike Pence did, saying that this somehow helps consumers. But the way that they say that is they try to pretend like this rule was going to get rid of arbitration entirely, that we would be forced into class action lawsuits, which is basically just turning the truth on its head, because right now we're forced into arbitration. We have no choice but to file an arbitration. This would have restored that choice. You could have chosen to go into arbitration, or you could have chosen to join a class action lawsuit. That's all this rule did. It was actually very moderate in the end. So they, one, just misrepresent what it does. But they also try to pretend that somehow class action lawsuits don't actually help people, which, again, shouldn't even really matter if you want to choose. We can argue about which one's better all day, but all we're saying is that people should have a choice if they want to pick arbitration or not. But they try to argue that they don't help people and that arbitration was somehow a better mechanism. But what's funny about that is you would think that if arbitration actually did help consumers, we would choose it and they shouldn't be threatened. But that's pretty much the only arguments they had. They were very weak.
I've got another one from the audience, and actually we talked about this beforehand. There's a link to the sexual harassment problem. Raven Listener says, Raven Listener still wants to know why a TV president, Kevin Spacey, is held to a higher standard than the actual president. So we could talk about that too. But these, what is it? When you sign one of these deals, you're not allowed to talk about it, and that's how, both in terms of sexual harassment, but also the Wells Fargo scandal just snowballed with all of these victims basically muzzled and not able to warn their fellow citizens.
Yeah, so actually it's funny, we were just talking about conservatives. Gretchen Carlson has been a huge advocate against forced arbitration because she saw it play out in her sexual harassment scandal with Roger Ailes. So what happened there is she actually was trying to sue Fox News and Roger Ailes in court, but because there was a ripoff clause in her employment contract, she wasn't able to do that and ended up having to, settle. Luckily, she was able to settle because of the level of attention. But now she had to sign a non-disclosure agreement where she can't actually talk about what Roger Ailes did. So we now have Roger Ailes out. We've seen a ton of scandal around Fox News and sexual harassment, but we don't have the actual stories because secret arbitration blocks people from talking about it. So that's how it plays into the sexual harassment scandals. I think, luckily Gretchen Carlson has been able to kind of push on this issue and inspire, I think, a lot of other women and people to come out about sexual harassment. But you see how arbitration helps keep these stories under wraps. And the way it played out with Wells Fargo is consumers had actually been trying to sue Wells Fargo since 2013, alleging fake accounts. This is before any of us had any idea this was going on. But because those suits only came out in arbitration instead of in our court system where there are public records, we didn't find out about it for another 3 years, and Wells Fargo just kept profiting. So I'm actually really worried now that the Republicans have, gotten rid of this consumer protection and essentially made secret arbitration the law of the land, because I think this could easily lead to another financial crisis, and we won't know it's coming until it's already too late.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to put the microphone back to my mouth. Wow. I did. Okay, so this could lead to another financial crisis, and it's because, think about all the people that were sexually harassed by Roger Ailes and others at Fox News because of these non-disclosure agreements, right? It's like in a monster movie, right? There's this horrible blob that's running around disintegrating people, but because the victims can't live to tell, then there's more people endangered.
Exactly, and I think just the last few years and the way that activism has erupted across the internet, it shows how much power we have when we're able to share information with each other, and when we know we're not alone in being harassed or ripped off or hurt in any way, and that's part of the power of class action lawsuits and our right to court and our right to just be able to tell our story, on the media. But that's exactly what arbitration gets at. It silences us. It takes away our power. It takes away our ability to collectively organize, and that's exactly how these big powerful interests are going to be able to defeat us. So I think, this issue, just like we were talking about earlier, this is not a particularly sexy issue. A lot of people, they're brains turn off when they hear the word arbitration. But what this really comes down to is our right to collectively organize against the most powerful forces in this country. I think it affects every issue out there.
Okay. I wanted to give you a chance to respond to the analogy to the sexual harassment epidemic. And then I have another question for you, Amanda, from our audience.
It actually feels and is very bleak, because with sexual harassment, most people don't come forward in the first place. They keep it to themselves for all kinds of reasons. So the ones that do come forward, that's a very big, brave step. And then what happens?
Yeah, and then they can't actually tell their story, and they can actually be sued for. What's funny is they'll make you sign a non-disclosure agreement, they'll force you into secret arbitration, and then if you break the non-disclosure agreement, they'll sue you in court. And that's the other piece of this, is that it not only helps silence people who have the least power, but it also stops, it's a one-sided system. Banks and lenders can still sue you, your employer can still sue you, your sexual harasser can still sue you, but you can't sue them. That's why it's about power. It's not just about courts or anything else.
And they always get you on the way in the door. So everyone wants a job. So you sign a contract when you get a job, and you're like, oh, good, I have a job, great. You might not read everything in there, or you might think, well, I don't think I'm going to have to sue my employer, so I'll just sign this. And then it turns out it puts you in legal jeopardy, prevents you from seeking a day in court, and it prevents you from warning other people if you are victimized. It prevents you from warning other people who are in harm's way. So here's a question back to the banking side of this. So the law that Trump signed, preventing Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from actually protecting consumers, that's, I assume, only in a certain sector. But how far does it go? Melanie Ann wants to know, what about credit unions and small banks?
So, yeah, what's interesting about credit unions and small banks here is that by and large, they do not use forced arbitration clauses. And you can imagine why. They have, first of all, I think they're more rooted in the community. They actually care about the people they're serving. They're not these kind of faceless corporate giants that just want the maximum profit. But also, I don't think they're really at risk of class action lawsuits. They generally have good enough relationships with their consumers that they can, work things out before it gets to that level. So they don't use these clauses, but strangely enough, their lobbying groups, their kind of trade associations, came out against the CFPB rule and for this legislation. And in fact, I think we're really used as a prop by the Chamber of Commerce and the big banking lobbyists to try to pretend that this was about small banks, even though it doesn't affect them at all. So it was really disgusting, and I think we're seeing now, when Trump has signed this, when Mike Pence cast a tie-breaking vote, they're trying to use community banks and credit unions as a cover for what they did, even though this really just benefits not only big banks, but big banks that want to break the law, like Wells Fargo, and financial giants like Equifax.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up in a second. I'm going to bring it back to the sexual harassment thing, only because Raven Listener gave us the opportunity to, in a very organic way, talk about it. And I think it's something we should have been talking about it, because it's hit every industry I've ever worked in now. I mean, I was in Hollywood for a long time. Then I got into journalism. NPR, I cannot freaking believe that. And think of all the stories that NPR did about Fox News. And it just how rampant it is. So we have two women here. I want to give you guys a chance to respond and, just share your thoughts and your concerns. Ida?
Yeah, actually. So I kind of got my first taste of just the power dynamic in the first job I ever had, my first internship ever. Basically, boss was kind of hitting on me, and I was no, I shut it down. But then he all of a sudden stopped assigning me stories, stopped letting me do anything, and it's my internship, so it's I'm trying to learn, and he just kept shutting me down and wouldn't let me. He had complete control over me, and I didn't know how to complain about it, because he was the one signing off on my internship so I could get credit for it. I just had to take it, really, and just wait until it was over. It feels so helpless to be in a situation where the power dynamic is like that. And ask any woman, I'd be shocked if a woman didn't have some sort of experience.
Yeah, I certainly haven't met anyone who's not a cis man that hasn't had that experience. And I mean, you're exactly right. It's all about power dynamics and who's holding the cards. And I think luckily we're seeing, because people are coming out in mass numbers and people are able to share their stories and, realize that people aren't alone in this experience, we're starting to see some level of change. I hope that continues. But that's exactly the danger of what's going on in this country right now, is there's this, across things, not just on this rule, not just in the area of arbitration, there's power is collecting itself. Corporations are taking over the government. Even the Republicans that are in power are really, they're making sure they don't have to actually work with Democrats ever. Trump is trying to expand his executive power as far as he possibly can. And we're just seeing this entrenchment of the oldest forces that have, oppressed pretty much everyone else for centuries. And I think that's what's really dangerous here, is we suddenly have, the ability to come together on the internet and in organizing in a way we haven't before, but now they're changing the laws and they're changing the resources so that we can't actually do anything about it. That's why we need to keep fighting against this in every industry across sectors.
And the silver lining is, when one person tells their story, that's why it snowballs, and that's why those non-disclosure things are so dangerous, because it's would it have snowballed to the sexual harassment thing? Would it have snowballed if all these women didn't feel empowered by other women sharing their stories? I don't think so.
Absolutely not. It's been amazing in the last few weeks just how many people have come out with the Me Too stuff, and just people with big platforms and that really put themselves at risk by saying this, and people who don't have big platforms that are sharing their stories. I think it shows the chain reaction of when one person is brave, it inspires another person to do something brave, and that's really the thing that is most threatening to those in power.
Let me toss out a legislation idea and see what you guys think. What if you guys just combine the issues and said, okay, let's take it out of the banking industry per se and say these hidden forced arbitration clauses are illegal no matter what business you're in. And also when you're an employee coming in, you can't make your employees sign something that puts them in a position where if they are sexually harassed or otherwise abused at work, that their legal recourses are limited. Do you think that is something that might be able to, move in a bipartisan way through this Congress or a future one?
Well, so it's funny that you suggest that. That's exactly the bill that Senator Al Franken has been reintroducing for several Congresses now, I think since 2010 or so. It's called the Arbitration Fairness Act, and it would go beyond what the CFPB rule did, because it would affect not only the financial industry, it would affect employment contracts, sexual harassment, discrimination, antitrust cases. It would basically just restore our Seventh Amendment right to a day in court across the board, which I think is exactly what we need. And frankly, we shouldn't even have to have legislation like that. We have a constitutional right that's not being respected. Unfortunately, he has introduced it. It has not been bipartisan. I don't think there's been one Republican supporting it. I don't know why the Constitution has become a partisan issue, but it seems that it has. I hope that the consumer outrage that we've seen about this bill passing and Trump signing it into law yesterday will be harnessed to pass legislation like that is broader. I really hope that we can take this defeat and turn it into a larger win for the battle overall.
I'm sorry, I got another good comment here from Anthony. He said, can we agree that it was lobby money to politicians, bribe money, that led to this vote in Congress, 51-50, and the president signing this law?
We can absolutely agree on that. Yes. Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned, I work for a nonprofit. I'm a lawyer. I'm the only person who was working full time, 100% of my time, on the consumer side of this issue. And we were massively outgunned. We were against the Chamber of Commerce, which is the largest lobbying group in the country. It has hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on these small issues. We were against the American Bankers Association, which is the biggest financial lobby in the country. We had a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of people working against us. And that's what ultimately won. It was, the Republicans' loyalty to their campaign donors instead of their constituents. And I think now, after this vote, we have to make sure we hold them accountable for that, and we make sure they know that money is not what gets people elected, votes are, and we need to show up in 2018 and make them pay for this decision and all the other damage they've been doing this year.
Okay, so Ida Chavez, thanks so much for joining us from the Intercept. You're a new hire, right? How long you been there?
Like a month.
Okay. How's it going so far?
Great, I love it. It's like my dream job.
So those of you who see the Ryan Grimm segments that we do, Ida and Ryan often collaborate on pieces together. Tell us about some of those that you wrote with Ryan.
With Ryan, a bunch. One of my favorites was like probably the first story that I wrote at The Intercept, which was Lindsey Graham doesn't know what he's talking about. And
he was actually one of the 2 Republicans who voted the right way on this, for the record, but
it was about healthcare.
that's fair.
And for that one, like, we didn't have to do too much digging. He just kept saying it. Like, I didn't know anything about healthcare until I started doing this. Right. And so, yeah, that one was really fun to do.
Wait, so you started a month ago. Does that mean Monopoly Man was like one of your very first stories?
Yeah, I mean,
wow.
Yeah, it's one of them. Yeah.
It's been right about a month. That's interesting.
So at The Intercept, you can find Ida Chavez's first month of work. She was hired by Ryan Grimm. Ryan and I will be together on TYT Investigates Facebook page, facebook.com/TYT Investigates, at 4:30 to talk about the new tax reform proposal coming out of the House of Representatives. And what was the last thing? I wanted to tell you guys one last thing. Oh, yeah. Monopoly Man, Amanda Werner, tell us where people can find you on the web. And it looks like you're going to be the one. I mean, you're the one. You're the chosen one. You're going to lead this fight. People who want to join with you, where can they find you?
So I actually just have been launching some videos recently. I just started a new fan page. It's facebook.com/MonopolyMan series. You can follow on there. Just yesterday, we actually released a video on the tax scam bill with Elizabeth Warren, so you should go check that out, Monopoly Man series. And you can follow me on Twitter at WAmandaJD is my handle there. And we'll have lots of new content. I'm trying to, leverage the interest in these issues, the interest in Monopoly Man, into something bigger, and hopefully we can, win this fight in the end.
All right. And tell them thanks and bye.
Thanks and bye.
Thanks for watching.